Well, thank you all for coming. This is very exciting. It's also kind of scary because as we wandered around the show this evening, a lot of people who were in grad school, or a number of them who are in grad school with me, have shown up, and people who are in the show and who I teach with have shown up here too, and so I'm going to be talking about their work. So that's always a little scary. So if I make a mistake or I say something about your work you don't like, just jump in and correct me. Or if I get some date wrong, fix it for me. And for the rest of you, ask questions. When I'm talking, it's really nice if you burst in and ask a question, because it really fleshes out what I'm talking about, and it helps expand the whole discussion, and it helps me when I've forgotten some things if you bring something up, and then we can go on in that direction, and it might even be more interesting. This talk is a bit of history. It's a memoir. Art is always contingent. It's never absolute, and art doesn't happen in isolation. What you're doing now is affected by what is happening and what is around you, true now, and it was true then. Radical ceramics didn't happen in a vacuum. By the 1960s, beat poets and the bohemian lifestyle had been in San Francisco mainstay for most of the decade. Across the bay and infected by the same creative attitudes, UC Berkeley was historically receptive to radical thinking. Berkeley consistently hired faculty whose intellectual and scientific investigations reshaped the world. By 1965, the UC campus had 13 Nobel laureates, including the physicist E.O. Lawrence and the chemist Glenn Seaborg and Melvin Calvin, if you know your science. The faculty included Clark Kerr and the psychology professor Edward Tolman. In 1954, Tolman's activism took him all the way to the state Supreme Court in a fight to overturn university requirement that faculty must sign an anti-communist loyalty oath. Tolman won his case. The California Supreme Court ruled that UC must reinstate protesting faculty who were fired because they refused to sign the oath. 10 years later, in 1963, Clark Kerr, now chancellor of the university, renamed the Graduate School of Education Tolman Hall. So this gives you a little picture of what kind of an environment Berkeley was, and why so many things started there and took place there in the 60s and going into the 70s. California native and UC graduate Joan Didion said in an interview, "The whole way I deal with politics came out of the English department. I loved Berkeley. It was like waking up." The use of clay has deep roots in Northern California. Once considered a form of craft, it took the ingenuity, creativity, and vision of artists like Robert Arneson and Peter Vokus to look beyond the medium's utilitarian properties to its expressive qualities. In the decades following, their successors continued to stretch the boundaries of clay sculpture. And that's what this story is going to be about. This story really has no beginning. I'm going to jump right into the middle of things in Los Angeles. So you guys have all been out in the gallery, and there's that magnificent mural, which I know all you Angelinos are aware is Millard Sheets. And in 1954, he was appointed director of the Otis Art Institute. And he wanted to have a really dynamic and exciting ceramic program at Otis. It wasn't called Otis, but I'm not going to go into all this sort of history down here because you guys know it better than I do. And he had heard about this fabulous potter who did beautiful and very strong and dynamic work, who was working in Bozeman, Montana. And so he asked Peter Vokus to come and head up the ceramic department at Otis. And so Vokus was hired and was going to start teaching in 1954. But in 1950, during the summer, before he came in 54, he went off to Black Mountain to teach, and he met John Cage and David Tudor and Bob Rauschenberg and Joseph Albers. He went to New York and he hung out at the Cedar Bar. And so by the time he got to Otis, he was really thinking about clay in a different way than he had as a potter coming out of Montana. And so he took this and ran with it, and he had this studio in Los Angeles that he shared with John Mason, and the Otis studio where he worked, and his first student, as you guys all are aware, Paul Soldner, and they really started opening clay up and doing dynamic things, and building sculpture. And of course the studios, Vokus' studios, always have been were open 24 hours a day, and everybody was welcome, the auditors, as we called them, and there was just a lot going on. And Millard Sheets wasn't so happy about this. This isn't what he had hired this guy, and he got this guy. And so he fired him. So Berkeley, being the kind of place that I just described, hired Vocus because they wanted somebody who was going to change the world in their ceramic department. This is what their ceramic department looked like when Pete arrived. This was called the Pot Shop, and it didn't really bother Pete because he just went to work like he always did. And I think that maybe he heard a hint that they were going to give him a new studio in 1964 because they were building Worcester Hall, and by 1964 there was a brand new ceramic studio with all kinds of imaginable facilities in those days. But Pete got to work, and one of the characteristics was whenever Pete was going to do a demo is the world showed up. And there's no computers, there's no cell phones, there's nothing. You don't know how everybody knew about it, but they did. And there was always an audience for his demonstrations. Some of his early students, Jim Melchert and DeStabler, Ann Christensen, Mary Hallman, Eric Gromberg, and Joe Puglisi. Eric Gromberg just had a great, huge survey show at ASU in Arizona. And June Kaneko was there for a time. John Mason was teaching. Pete went on a sabbatical, and John Mason did some teaching. I'm not sure of Michael Fremkes' status, but he was there. And the plate that you see on the bottom with his name running over the top is over at the Scripps Mara collection. It's always been one of my favorite pieces of his. I kind of maintain this fantasy that he maybe made it at Berkeley. Some of the other students, Yuta Savage and Anna Dare Vocus, Anna Dare, who became Pete's wife, Andre Thompson, and Sue Newman. One of the things I noticed as I was putting these images together and looking at these different artists' work was that it sort of broke down that the men were working with stoneware and the women seemed to work in porcelain. But otherwise there was that same tactile quality that Pete always had in his work. And there was a certain kind of thread of what people later called abstract expressionism in the way everybody worked in clay at that time. In 1964, the free speech movement started, and if you look, you can see the dress code. The men all wore suits. These are all students. They're all wearing suits and little narrow ties, and the women all wore skirts in those days. That's Mario Savio. If you look to the right, is it for you, right? Yeah, the right. Of the free speech sign, that taller man there, that's Mario Savio, who you've probably all heard about and who was the leader of the free speech movement. And so this is sort of one of the very first demonstrations and political protests that came out of Berkeley that, as you know, moved on and really reshaped politics and social thinking in this country over the years. The free speech movement was interesting in the sense that it was a one-issue movement. It wasn't about changing the world. It was about allowing free speech on Sproul Plaza. So students were allowed to set up tables and solicit for their various organizations. And so students started setting up tables for political causes and for other things outside of organizations that had to do with the campus. And the university administration, in their great wisdom, decided that this was not okay, that the tables on Sproul Plaza should only be for designated university activities. So the free speech movement, they said, no, that's not free speech, you're curtailing free speech and we won't allow it. And so there was a huge protest. And one student was arrested and he was put in this cop car that had driven up onto Sproul Plaza, and you see it right there in the middle with Mario Savio standing on top of it. So all the community was the students and the faculty all gathered, and so this student, I'm not remembering his name, he's locked in the car there, and the students all let the air out of the tires, and Savio got on top of the car, and he became really the spokesman. He was very articulate. And a lot of these students who were leading the free speech movement had been already in the South with the civil rights movement, and they really understood peaceful protest and nonviolent protesting. They were actually quite experienced. They weren't just a bunch of kids that ran out of class and started doing something. They had had some background, and they felt this was very important and tied into what they had been doing in terms of civil rights. And so they did back down the administration. And today there's actually a monument on Sprout Plaza to free speech, and it's a little hole in the ground, and all the air above it is free. So back in the studio on campus, the radical movement in clay is still continuing, and so this is the time when I'm there as a student. I came in 1967, and Pete Vokus had a tradition of coming in on Tuesday and throwing, and then on Thursday he would put the work together. So there was always a sign up that said, demo on Tuesday and Thursday, and Pete came in. And there's also a mythology that this was an all-male kind of environment, which it wasn't. There were plenty of women students, as you saw from some of the early work I showed you, and we'll continue with that. There were a lot of women students, and a lot of them who've gone on and continued, as artists. Here you see Pete working in the studio. So this is the new Worcester Hall that opened in 1964, and him working in the studio there. And I think this is sort of the period from the 59 when he came and into the 60s, where Pete really developed his voice in terms of creating these stacks, which went on to become his signature work. And he always threw, and the other pieces that you saw at Otis were made from pots that had been thrown and sliced apart. But it's at this point that the work kind of becomes pots in his way, in his very signature and special way. The other thing about it is that all his glazes and all his raw materials were just there for us to use. The recipes were up on the board, and I have a notebook with all my student notes, and they have Pete's clay body and Pete's black recipe, and there wasn't any secrecy. And I didn't learn until much later, when after I'd graduated and went back east to teach, that ceramics artists had secrets, and they didn't let everybody know what their glazes were. I'd never heard of such a thing. It was Pete's recipes that were up there on the board, and I'm sure Ray probably has them in his notebook too. So Patrick Seiler was a very critical component. He was the studio technician, and made all the clay and the big buckets of glazes, and his recipes, like Seiler's Gray and Gold, were up on the board too. And one of the things you have to keep in mind that made this time very, very different than education today is the University of California was basically free. It was $65 a semester. And the clay was all free, the red lead and the uranium and the white lead and the barium and the lithium and all those raw materials, they were all free too. And so we just went in, we didn't wear masks or know anything about that. We just went in with our scoop and took them out of the bin and mixed up glazes. And Patrick was there. He sort of, I don't want to say he lived in the studio, but it had that element. He taught us how to bake bread in coffee cans in the kiln. And the other thing is he was equal to Pete in the sense of his work ethic and the amount of work that he could do. And again, at Berkeley, there was this sort of sense of pots. It's not pottery, but it's pots. And so there's that hollow form, and there's a reference to pots. And so these are all Patrick Seiler's wizardware. They're, as you can see, the sense of scale and stenciling and this sort of sense of silliness and playfulness that went on in the whole community at Berkeley. That's a cookie jar of Patrick's up there on the right corner, glazed with Pete's black, and then some stencil platters of Patrick's. And again, you can see all those cookie jars, and his dog Barco, who was a Basenji, so he didn't bark. And he pretty much lived in the studio. There's big signs all over Berkeley, and they've always been there, and they say no dogs. But Barco maybe wasn't a dog. Ron Nagel was there teaching. He had been in San Francisco, and then he was hired to teach for a while at Berkeley before he went on to Mills, where he just retired. And of course, he brought this whole music, and his tradition of working both in ceramics and in music into the studio and into our sort of awareness as students. Ron Nagel also was a pioneer in doing low fire and decals and color, and a lot of his work was pink. And he did that famous decal of Peter Vokus on that black cup. And his work was also small and much more delicate. It was a big contrast between the macho sort of attitude of Vokus's work. Bob Hudson was also on the sculpture faculty, so he wasn't in the ceramic department, but he was on the sculpture faculty, and he did a number of ceramic pieces. 2 of them are on the right there, and then you probably know him because, I mean, he's quite a renowned sculptor, and most of the time works in metal, but he's often collaborated with Richard Shaw on big bodies of work, and they've exhibited together. And that's a picture of him up there with Richard working. They had a show at the San Francisco Museum of Art, I think it was in 70, I don't know if it's 73 or 79, do you know, Nathan?
Mark 73.
73, okay, and then they did another one more recently. And then Jim Melcher went from being Vokus's student to coming on the faculty, and his work always had much more of a conceptual, intellectual air to it. He's a very intellectual and conceptual person and very inspired by John Cage. And he also, like Ron Nagel, brought the low fire and the color and low fire clays, which, you know, were always considered for kids. Children use low fire clays, but, you know, here we are, adults, we're using it too. It's really nice stuff. At that time, Vokus was very involved in working in bronze and bronze casting, and his studio down on the railroad tracks just off Gilman Street was created as a foundry, and he did all his bronze casting there. And so I think as a student, one of the things for me was, oh, well, if you want to cast bronze, you create a foundry in your studio, so that anything you wanted to do, you just went and did it. There weren't limitations. You just had to figure out a way to make it happen and get the space to do it in. So that, you know, that was kind of our, I think, our training as what it takes to be an artist is if you want to do it, if you want to cast bronze, you build a foundry. If you want to work in clay, you know, you get all the materials necessary. So again, whenever Pete was going to cast something, there was that word went out, oh, there's going to be a pour. And everybody raced down. This is always in the middle of the night because Pete had a big sign on the door of his studio that said, day sleeper, do not disturb. He never did anything, you know, when it was daylight. It always took place in the night. So we always raced down there late at night, and you can see the molten bronze in that big, I don't know, what do you call it, a furnace? And, well, the crucible is what they're pouring it into, yeah. And so we, you know, again, this is like the red lead and the uranium and the barium and the lithium. So we're just all standing around there in a circle, and Pete says to us, he says, okay, well, if anything blows up, cover your eyes. And so this is some of the work he was doing, and he did this for quite a period of time, and it was all, again, very abstract, you know, really forms and shapes and the kind of tension and projections into space that he couldn't get working in clay. So it had a very different tone to it than what he did in ceramic. And he was given a commission to do a piece in front of the Hall of Justice in San Francisco. And I believe this is the piece on the flatbed it's going to go across the bridge over into San Francisco. And so, you know, you can see the parts to the piece, and you can see a little sketch of it there. You know, this is a very abstract, it's 30 feet high. There's nothing offensive about this work. But the outrage, so these are pages from the Chronicle in September of 1967, and then for weeks on, stories in the Chronicle, and the complaints, they called it macaroni. Some of the comments were, it looks like macaroni, it's disgusting, it stinks, it looks like hell. A butcher's table with something being disemboweled, a diabolical plot by a paranoid plumber, suitable for the mud flats or the zoo. There's just incredible outrage over this, you know, very harmless, you know, kind of exciting in that era bronze piece, which today out there in front of the Hall of Justice is very acceptable, and it was just refurbished. You see Anne Vokus in the lower, the shorter person in the circle at the bottom there. That's Anne, and they're rededicating it. They had to cut all the bushes back, and so it's been sitting there for all these 50 years. And of course, it's not in the least bit offensive, and by a lot of today's public art, it's very, very tame. So it shows you what happens with time. You know, time does wonders. Another one of Pete's students was Richard Marquez, who started out in clay. And if you know anything about his glass work, you can see the origins here in this Neriage ceramic work that he was doing in clay. And one of the sort of rumors and stories was that when Dick decided to go work in glass upstairs with Marvin Leposky. I hope you all know that Marvin just died. Did you know that? It's really sad, just 2 days ago. Yes, the day before yesterday. But Dick studied with Marvin. Marvin was upstairs, so ceramics was on the ground floor, Worcester Hall, and then Marvin was in the middle floor, and then textiles with a lot of the people that you know, Leah Cook and Nance O'Banion and Ginge Lockie. They were all doing textiles at that time, and Marvin and a lot of people who went on to be leaders in the glass field. And so Dick went upstairs, and the rumor was that Pete was really angry because he knew he'd lost a superstar. And so Dick, these are some of his early glass works where he was doing fumed and forms, kind of taking off from the Egyptian. Gifford Myers, who some of you might know, was there as a student. Ray Ford, who's here in the audience, one of the people that scared me showing up in his... Is this correct, Ray? Gail Landrum. Yun Chung Kim, who she did a lot of work both with Marvin and in ceramics, so combining glass and fur and very surrealistic, these are really large pieces. And then some of the artists went on to do production work, Polly Frizzell and Eleanor Eden, Jerry Oyama and Alan Eaker ended up in Florida. All students there at that time. Some of my work, my student work. And then what happened in 1967 is John Copeland's had curated the Abstract Expressionist Ceramics exhibition that had opened in Southern California, and it came to the San Francisco Museum of Art. And so here we were, students, and we go to the museum, and there are all our teachers, all our mentors, all the people we'd heard about, and their work is in this major exhibition at San Francisco Museum of Art. So this is what ceramics is. This is, the ultimate in ceramic work. John Mason, who I hadn't met, but Pete showed slides and talked about him all the time, and of course Ron Nagel, and a lot of Vocus was quite emphasized in the show. Jim Melcher, and then Ken Price, Billy Al Bengston. So all these people that we'd been studying, they were now the standard. They were the ultimate in what was happening in clay. And so I think that coming out of Berkeley at this time, you aren't really aware. There weren't very many magazines. There weren't very many books. You weren't aware that there were potters in the world. There wasn't pottery. There was ceramic sculpture. And Copeland's wrote in the catalog that the peak of ceramic development was undoubtedly between these years 56 and 58. So we know that, we got to take that with a grain of salt. But it was the first radical movement to totally revolutionize ceramics. And of course for us, what was being done was now mainstream. But he didn't reckon with Peter Seltz. And a few months later, Peter Seltz curated the Funk Show, which didn't take place in a museum, but it took place at the campus art gallery. And who's the star of the Funk Show but Bob Arneson? And so this is a whole new look at ceramics. So for myself, and I don't know Ray or the other students how much they were aware of what was happening at Davis, but this is what was going on at UC Davis. And so just like UC Berkeley, the university was looking for people who were really doing something new, people who were changing what was happening in the field, not just producing the same old, same old. And so here you have Barb Arneson. And so this people really did find shocking and offensive. It wasn't, though. It was actually really fun. And some of the other work in the show, Manuel Neary and his loops, David Gilhooly, Roy DeForest, and Joan Brown with her kind of muskrat there. It was kind of a stretch for Peter Vocus to be in a funk show, so he had this girl with slit walking through grass. I don't know if it ever appeared anywhere else. And of course, Ken Price, this is definitely not funky. So, Seltz was kind of pushing the boundaries. He just wanted to put a bunch of revolutionary work together, and so, he gave it that title because that was very compelling and it really drew out critics and it drew an audience. And Jerry Belaine had been pioneering vacuum forming, and Ron had been working with him, and you'll see that in some of his work. So here are some of the artists who were in the funk show. And again, there's that legend that everything was all male. Well, it is dominated by men, but so was the whole university system, and so was a lot of things. But there were a number of women that were included in all these, on the faculty and in these exhibitions. And so Bob Arneson, as you know. And so, at Davis, there was Richard Shaw and Tom Rippon, Bob Brady and Arthur Gonzalez and Clayton Bailey. Clayton Bailey came from Wisconsin, but he came because he saw what was happening at Davis. He'd been invited there to teach for a semester, and he saw what was happening, and he saw that it really fit his sensibility and that he belonged there, that he didn't fit in Wisconsin. And so he moved out, and he bought a house next door to Roy DeForest, and he's still there working. He actually has a museum of his own now, Clayton Bailey's Museum in Port Costa, if you're ever up that way. Definitely, it's like one of those roadside, the biggest ball of string or the biggest rubber band. It's just perfect, Clayton Bailey. And Viola was teaching at CCA at the time, and she wasn't included in the funk show, which I think was a mistake or oversight or something, but Viola was there in the Bay Area working. In 1969, Marilyn Levine showed up. She'd been in Canada, and she'd met Jim Melchert up there, and he'd convinced her that she was trained as a chemist. She worked as a chemist. That was her degree, and she was doing ceramics, and Jim Melchert convinced her if she really wanted to do ceramics, she should come to Berkeley. And so she did. She enrolled in the MFA program at Berkeley, and she worked for a little while abstractly, and then she immediately hit her stride, really taking advantage of her chemistry background to start making work that looked like leather. And I'm sure most of you have seen something of hers. Some of it is just so realistic, people just have to touch it. And even then, sometimes they don't believe it. And the piece on the bottom, so there's all this play back and forth between the different personalities. And that piece, the leather shaving kit on the bottom, if you look carefully, you can see it says PWS, Patrick Walter Seiler. And some of her work was based on real objects that people owned. Her work just got more and more realistic. And for all of us in grad school, she was like this amazing miracle, because right out of grad school she was at OK Harris in New York, and her work just fit into what was happening in terms of realism and pop art. And she had a major gallery in San Francisco, and it was a sort of unheard of phenomenon that a grad student would have such success immediately. And of course, out on the street, there was still a revolution going on. And there was free music, free drugs, free posters, and there was a revolution in design. And these psychedelic posters were handed out at Sprout Plaza. You could just go all the time and get posters for all the shows. And there was always free music in the park. And the interesting thing is this was the first time you ever had an announcement for a show that you couldn't read what was on the poster. But I do have a whole collection of these. And so then in 1968, I'm kind of backtracking a little bit here just to throw Marilyn in. The university still owns a piece of property on Telegraph Avenue, a few blocks away from the physical campus, maybe 5 or 6 blocks up to Telegraph from the physical campus. And so this became like a park, and everybody hung out there, and they planted gardens, and there were all the hippies, and there were the students, and of course everybody's smoking dope. Drugs is a very lightweight drug scene in those days. It's nothing like today. And the violence, there was pretty lightweight too. People didn't carry guns. And so there was all this going on in People's Park. And, it was just this kind of place where people hung out. It was nothing, there was a clothing bin where you could trade clothing and stuff like that. But you could see people tended it. The art department made this huge sign. It's kind of big, yellowish, reddish orange. It says no, K-N-O-W. This big 3-dimensional letters made out of masonite and painted very high lacquer paint. But the university, in their great wisdom, decided they didn't want this happening on their property, and they fenced it in with a big chain link fence. And the reaction this time, unlike the reaction to the free speech movement, was a lot more violent. They called out the Alameda County sheriffs. So this is the sheriffs around the chancellor's house. So these are the guys with the guns, not the students. And they rounded up the students in a quite violent and rough manner. They were taken down to Santa Rita prison. We had to go get our cousin Judy out from Santa Rita prison. That was an experience. The dress code changed dramatically. And the violence really escalated. This is on Telegraph Avenue, and one young man, James Rector, was killed. So things had kind of turned a corner here on protests and demonstrations. Gifford Myers doing a ceramic piece in recognition of what was happening. Ron Nagel then had his show opened at the Dilexi. I think this is in 1968. Is that right, Nathan? 68? Yeah. And so this was a really big deal, this huge show of Ron Nagel's cups that we've been dying to see. You know, we saw little bits and pieces of him, and he'd been working with Jerry Belaine on the vacuum forming. And so in that manner of Japanese boxes that you open and take out this precious object, he had these flocked cases. I believe his father made these fine wooden cabinets, and the vacuum formed reverse replica of the cup inside these boxes. So this was a really dramatic and insightful experience to have at this time in 1968. So, you know, you have to put yourself in the mindset of what's happening in the world and then imagine these cups coming out as, you know, artwork. And then Terry and her husband Dave, which one's her husband? Mark. Terry and Mark and her husband and their friend Dave, they opened Sam's Cafe. It was an old restaurant on University Avenue. So one of the early alternative spaces, and they had a lot of alternative exhibitions, very, I wouldn't say pornographic, but suggestive shows and all kinds of wild things in terms of, you know, really portends what happens with an alternative space where you can do alternative things. And this is a book that they produced. And there you see a picture of Bob Hudson, and then that's Dave with a paper plate that says "Christ is nice." So, you know, a lot of anti-establishment. And then in 1970, the beginning of the anti-war movement. So Berkeley, of course, this is really the starts at Berkeley, and the gallery that was where we all had our master shows was taken over to silkscreen posters and to do production, you know, for the anti-war movement. And so these are all posters that were designed and produced by students in the art department or in the ceramic and design department. This is a piece by I'm blocking on his name, Eric Gromberg, an anti-Vietnam War piece. And then in 1969, the new Oakland Museum opened, and Peter Vokus was asked to design and create the poster for the opening of the museum. So naturally, we're not going to have a paper poster. This is cast vacuum-formed blue acrylic with the bronze overlay and aluminum insert, because you wouldn't want something very traditional. And then my master's show, which was in 1970, and some of the cups from that time. So I was very influenced by Ron Nagel and his colors. I grew up here in Southern California, and so I had a real feeling for the light and the color, California kind of sensibility. And I've always thought of myself as a California person. And I was taken with all that low fire and what Ron had been doing and the airbrush. And so this is some of the work that I did. And then one of the, I'm going to, move away a little bit now and go kind of into the community and a little larger picture of, the lineage that came out of the Bay Area. But one of the reasons that Berkeley and Davis and all of us working there, the other people, could get so much done and had such access to materials was because of Leslie's Ceramics. And John Toki, who just sold Leslie's, but he grew up there and his parents founded it in 1946, is that right? In 1946, and you see in that top picture on the very right is Leslie and Rayer Toki at a what do you call those, trade show. And they not only carried all the materials and the supplies, they also would get you anything you needed. So if you went in and you said you needed china paints of a certain type, Leslie would order them. And when Marilyn Levine started working in fiberglass, they happily ordered fiberglass. And when she switched to nylon, Leslie started carrying little bags of nylon fiber for everybody to work with. They made friends with all the artists and had artists over for dinner and collected their work. You see Jim Melchert and Viola and Art Nelson and Arneson would come down from Davis. He made a trip every month to Berkeley to go shopping at Leslie's and to go hang out with Pete. And so when I was putting all this together, I started this lecture years ago and putting it together, and it's kind of grown over the years. And I wrote to Patrick Seiler and asked him about it, and he wrote me a long letter, and he said that some great work was just over the hill, and all you needed to capture it was a hell of a lot of hard work and enthusiasm. And that cow pot shop was certainly a great opportunity for me. And so, we all grew up. And Patrick grew up, and he got a teaching position in Pullman, Washington, and he went on to do a lot of very large work with silhouettes in slip on clay. This is a big wall he did, and he did some of these in color. And he also did a lot of painting. He kind of gave up ceramics for a while and did a lot of painting. And Ann Christensen is also up there at Washington with Patrick. And out front of the AMOCA here is a huge sewer pipe that he's been doing lately down in Phoenix with Brian Vancell at the Mission Clay. So he's been kind of back into doing his imagery on ceramic again. Jim Melchert has just gone on to do magnificent things, and this is like the dream review that every artist wants, that the San Francisco Chronicle critic wrote in 2011, that he can think of many reasons not to envy artists. But seeing Jim Melchert's work makes him wish I had something to comparably tangible and elegant and smartly realized to show for my time. I don't think you could get a better review than that. Stephen DeStabler went on to teach at San Francisco State and to just become probably the first artist in the field to really take on the art world and become part of the art world as a ceramic artist. John Toki he studied at Hayward, and then he studied at San Francisco State. And then he went on to work with Stephen DeStabler in the studio. And John Toki just makes large, enormous things like you see there with just great ease. And Richard Marquez went on to change the glass world. He went to Italy and brought back all his Marini techniques and has just done work that is just untouchable. And he has a huge facility, I call it his plantation, up in Whidbey Isle off of Seattle. And Clayton Bailey created his Chaolithic Society and all his Dr. Gladstone, and now there you see him in his museum up in Crockett. And he taught at Hayward for 30-some years. Richard Shaw and Bob Hudson went on to collaborate again, and they're good friends. And then Richard took over. He taught at the Art Institute in San Francisco for a long time, and then he went on to take Pete's teaching position at Berkeley when Pete retired, and then Richard just retired last year. Viola got smaller and smaller. Her work just got bigger and bigger. She was just magnificent. Just such a role model for all the women in the field. She's just an extraordinary person. Just some more about Viola's work. And then Mary Hallman moved to New York right after graduation in 1968, and she's been there ever since. And she's quite a renowned painter in New York, and recently she started back kind of reintroducing ceramics into what she's doing. And Squeak Carnweth, so Squeak is interesting. Squeak's very well known as a painter. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of her. And she taught at UC Davis and at Berkeley for a long time. But she got her degree at CCA, and while she was a student at CCA, she worked as Viola's studio assistant. So Squeak has a large ceramic background. And after Viola died, Squeak did a series of paintings and a tribute to Viola. And one of Viola's favorite things was the Portland vase, which was a glass vase, a Roman glass vase, and I'm not going to go into it because that's a whole lecture on its own. But this is kind of how these threads tie through generations. So this Portland vase, which was a Roman artifact that's in Britain, in the V&A, and Viola really loved it and did some big, ceramic interpretations of her vision of the Portland vase, and then Squeak doing paintings with her tribute to Viola. So these threads and these generations carry on year after year. And some of Arneson's students that I didn't show you their work, Karen Bresci and Tony Costanzo and John Roloff, who's really devoted his life to public art and just doing amazing things, Richard Notkin, Lou Skorka. And then some more contemporary work of the students that I went to school with, Ray Four, Gifford Myers, who heads up the program at UC Irvine, and Yun-Chung Kim, who came to Berkeley from Korea, and then she's been in San Diego for a long time and teaches down there. And goes back and forth between Korea and still continues with mixing glass and clay and doing these big installations. Marilyn Levine continued on and just, was a superstar. Some of my recent work, different than what's in the show here. Lisa Clegg, who studied at CCA and now lives in North Carolina and really makes her living doing her ceramic work. And Arthur Gonzalez, who was one of Lisa's students, Lisa was one of Arthur's students, and as he studied with Arneson, Mary Allison Lucas, who was a student at CCA and then went on to Davis, Alyssa Goss, another CCA student, and David Linger, who studied with Richard Shaw at Berkeley and then went on to study with Ron Nagel at Mills. And David doing these these are porcelain, very, very thin, like paper porcelain slabs that he runs through the press and tells these narrative stories with his photographs. And then two of the artists, thank you. Two artists who I think are the most radical of the young group that's coming up now, this next generation. My vote for the two artists who are really carrying on this radical tradition, Nathan Lynch, who's doing his own sculptural work, but also as a true mentor, he's working with his students on saving wildlife. And since he's here, I should really let him tell the story, but I'll try and get it right. Nathan started in 2009 outlining with the Nature Conservancy called Oikonos to ways that maybe they could help out these rhinoceros auk on Año Nuevo. Because what's happened, the rhinoceros auk are protected and they live on Año Nuevo, which is a preserve, but the sea lions, right, those 2,000-pound guys come crawling up on the shore, and the birds have dug their nests in the ground, and the sea lions come up unknowingly and just plop down and crush the eggs and crush the birds in the nest. So Nathan proposed that they do some ceramic nests to protect the birds underground from the sea lions. And so he worked with his students in 2010 to build these. They built 90 of these nests, and the nests are more than just for the birds. They're also for the naturalists. So they have a little cap so the naturalists can look in and sort of monitor things. And then there's a long tube that you see the tubes and the nests over there on the side that connect so the birds can go down into their tunnel and be protected. And the students went out and they put in 90 of these nests, and you told me there's almost all of them are occupied now? Yeah. So they really are functioning to save these birds, and those sea lions can just plop down anywhere they want now. And then in 2012, Nathan learned from the naturalists that there were caves on Channel Islands where the ravens came in and got the eggs and the babies out of the nests of these stormy petrels who put their nests in these caves, but the ravens would go in there and just grab them, and the naturalists would build plastic and wood, and they tried all these things and it just didn't work. But ceramic, you know? And so Nathan and his students designed and developed a way of protecting these stormy petrels so that they would use the nests, but the ravens weren't able to reach in and grab the birds. And so now they successfully have this under their belt. And whoops, sorry. And so this year, Nathan's working on a new project for some other Cassins auklets, which are on Año Nuevo, and they have their nests on top of the ground. But who's getting them? Not the some other birds are getting them. I can't remember.
It's the gulls, actually.
Oh, the gull, right. So the gulls are coming and going in their nests. And so, but these nests are on top of the surface of the beach, so they're working on how to deal with the issue of heat. Because if they put ceramic nests up there, how are they going to keep the heat from building up inside them? So this is a project that Nathan and his students are working on right now, and I know it's going to be very successful. So the other student who I think is doing the most radical work, he's not a student anymore, but he was a student down here in Los Angeles of Ken Price's, and then he went up to Berkeley and studied with Richard Shaw at Berkeley and got his master's degree up there, and that's Aaron Toole. And you probably all have seen the Craft in America, it's called Craft in America Service, and it's a video about artists who have been in the service and are doing work that deals with their experience in the service. And the film really features Aaron, and Aaron is just doing an incredible emotional and anti-war work. And rather than me talk about his work, I'm going to read you his own statement. But Aaron says that my work is about the collusion and the collision of military and civilian culture. My work is about war and violence. I make cups because that is the correct scale to talk about war, hand to hand. I've been trying to take my experience in the 1991 Gulf War and make something useful. I hope my cups build an abstract community of people who have my cups. I hope my cups are a place to enter into a conversation about the unspeakable experience of war. And at this point, Aaron's given away over 15,000 cups. He gives his work away as part of this conversation that he hopes will happen. And in 2010, he was able to go to Vietnam. He was given a grant to go to Vietnam, where his father had served in the war, and he made cups out of the red clay that had stained his father's patrol books. And then he gave those all away in Vietnam. Thank you.
We're willing to take a few questions if there's any questions. Well, if not, I see a hand in the back.
Nancy, do you see any perceptible difference in your perception?
Oh, Joe. Hi, Joe.
Between artists who come from Southern California and artists who come from Northern California? Or do you think those boundaries have been eroded?
I think they've eroded a lot, like Aaron studying down here and then coming up to Berkeley, and Nathan studying down here and then coming up to Mills and studying with Ron. So I think that as people are more mobile now and kind of move around and take what they're doing, so I think there's still differences, and I think there's emphasis in different places, but that's because there's a static community as well. But I think it's a lot different than before when there wasn't so much communication. Because I think as students, we didn't know what was happening in other parts of the country. It wasn't till I went back east that I really saw what all that dark pottery and those stoneware glazes were all about. Any other questions? Yes.
Yes, you tried to tie together the idea of aesthetic revolution with the idea of political revolution. But much of the literature that describes the actual antics of these idiosyncratic people say it was really highly individualistic, in fact often self-indulgent in terms of their preoccupation with the liberation of their own expression and wasn't as intimately tied to political and social issues as perhaps you indicated.
Oh, I love this. This is great. I didn't mean to imply that the work that was going on in the studio was necessarily tied to politics. But what I do really think was happening was that there was just a massive change going on. And it was happening in the studio aesthetically, as you mentioned, idiosyncratically. I think there was permission to be more idiosyncratic and not adhere to any kind of mainstream way of working. You know, Vocus brought that in. You know, here's this fantastic material, go to work, do what you want. And I think that had happened in New York with the painters, with the abstract expressionist painters, and it was happening in multiple materials. It was happening definitely in glass and in textiles. And so I think my reason to tie it into the political upheaval is not necessarily because they're connected, but that was the atmosphere, that there was all kinds of change going on. And so I don't think any of the artwork would have happened in a vacuum. I don't think it could have happened, you know, in a different time, that it was part of a whole social upheaval and an upheaval in thinking, especially in this country and especially in California at that time. But thank you for pointing that out. That's really a good question. Yes?
Is the field more open for women now? Is it still male dominated?
My two favorite picks for the most radical potters have ceramic artists were men, but I think there's incredible work going on by women, and one of the most renowned women working right now is Arlene Sheckett, and she's been on the cover of Art in America and been reviewed all over the New York Times, and I think it's the opportunities for women, especially in ceramics, I think are enormous because women do dominate the field in terms of numbers. They always have. And I think another Linda Lopez is just doing amazing work. And if you go over to the Scripps Annual, which will open next weekend, there's really powerful work by women in the show. So I think that just the way it's changed socially in many areas, I think it's changed in ceramics a lot, and because a lot of women have been in the field and they're there working and doing good stuff and interesting stuff. David?
You might know that the two most important positions in this museum are occupied by women.
That's true.
Executive director and our studio director.
Yes, definitely. Any other questions? I was very nervous because there's too many people here who knew what I was talking about.
Well, thank you, Nancy. This was a great lecture that ties so wonderfully to our current exhibition. And I want to thank all of you for joining us. And please grab a drink, go back and enjoy the show, and enjoy each other's company.